Hi everybody, my name is Borja Legarra. I'm a teaching fellow at the Institute of Archaeology, and I'm as well the coordinator of the BA in Classical Archaeology and Classical Civilization. I'm going to show you today a little bit of a taste of what is my current research, which is as well a little bit of an insight in the kind of approaches that are typical from the Institute of Archaeology in relationship to the study of the ancient Mediterranean. My question is not only Mediterranean. My question is, why do we have bosses? And it's to be fair to say that life hasn't been fair, or there is no such as an equal society. Age, gender, as well as an ability. Some people can hunt better. Some people can run faster. Makes that everybody has different roles and everybody has different access to resources and to decisions. But if we think in the history of Homo sapiens as a 24-hour day, the actual institutionalization of those differences have only occurred on the last 20 minutes of that day. That is about 7,000 years ago. You could be good at certain things, but it didn't really give you the rights to be different. We're starting to see that happening 5,000 years BC, in which we're starting to see people with different rights. We're starting to see representation of power with people more power than others. We're starting to see classes. We're starting to see people that has and people that has not, that economically can be more powerful or less powerful. Of course, that is a question that might have started a long time ago, but it's still something that we are struggling with it today. Who is in power? Are politicians the right thing? Are the right answer to our problems? Can we organize ourselves better? What are the agents of those power? Is it distributed equally as it should be or not? So it's trying to work out the start of those differences, those institutionalized differences in the Mediterranean. Why the Mediterranean? Because it seems to be a very highly dynamic scenario in which many communities around the sea explore ideas of social complexity quite early, not all at the same time, but we have clear archaeological evidence that in most places across the Mediterranean there was a moment in which state formation, social complexity seems to have developed, or at least the path towards development appeared, even when not all of them were successful. So the complexity seems to be a very Mediterranean phenomenon, but as well we have to understand it not as something that happened once and we have lived with the consequences since then. This is a process. So for example, let's see the more traditional explanations that they were typical a few decades ago. Those show that since the earliest instances of state formation could be found in Egypt and in Mesopotamia, everything else is more or less a cut of and paste. Everybody look at them and copy them because they thought they would be useful, or because local elites decided that they wanted as much power as that. We know now that that's not the case, that indeed things as social complexity of power don't only appear once, but it's a constant process of renegotiation, re-identification, redefinition, and that there are many paths and there are many reasons why that might have happened. Sometimes we see that it's a bottom-up process in which communities find benefits of having bosses, having leaders. Some other cases, some people makes the point that actually there were no real benefits, but we were conned, we were diddled into that social differentiations. So there's plenty of very healthy debate, not only about how that happened and the many ways in which that happened, but as well ethical questions about is that the right solution for certain problems that really reverting how we think about power and about inequality. For example, on the left, you can see what is called the Dunbar number. In that, it reflects that our brain can only handle a certain amount of social connections at any time. There is a limit to the people that we know, we can interact, and the information they provide and we can put together in the negotiation with all these people around us. If you look at the traditional communities across the Mediterranean, in this case it's data coming from the island of Crete, we see that most communities are actually not much larger than 500 people. That allow us to be organized in face-to-face manners, very simple, straightforward ways. So why move away from what it seems to be a highly flexible, resilient model? Why we have a small amount of communities that decided that it was beneficial for them to become larger, and with that creating major problems in terms of organization. We'll need people leading, people organizing, resources to be put together, taxes, administration. Decided that is a good solution. And a lot of people has highlighted that the Mediterranean might be very unique here, in the sense that climatically it is a difficult place. It's quite arid and the precipitation is not very regular. Some years can rain, some other years cannot rain at all. So that creates problems. At the same time, resources are not equally divided. Some regions are richer, some regions have copper or gold, some others don't. That could be comparable with other parts of the world. What is very unique to the Mediterranean is that you have a relatively easy to navigate sea in the middle of it. So connectivity is something that it is relatively easy to undertake, and it's a great solution for things about, for example, finding resources or trying to get resources you don't have. One year in which you have a poor harvest or you need more copper, and that brings a lot of communities and cultures to meet each other, and that creates a dynamism that perhaps is unique to this region. What we think in the Institute, and this is very typical for the Institute, perhaps because we have so many people looking at so many places across the globe, is that to understand such processes you have to think big. But if you think big, you have to start with the small. You have to start with the small areas. So what I'm going to present you today about my research is actually how we might mix that thinking and studying small for the bigger questions we have, and how things like comparison between regions could be actually quite useful and quite interesting. I know Crete, which everybody tends to have an understanding of. We have all, perhaps not all, but many of us, we have visited the island of Crete. We can see the Palace of Knossos. We all know about the Minotaur myth, King Minos. So we have a certain understanding of Minoan Crete, perhaps created by archaeologists more than actually real understanding of the culture it was, and as you can see in those pictures. Very unique. What is as well very interesting for archaeologists is probably the first complex society in Europe, the first state formation process, the first time we have a palace at the middle, or there is a huge community in the we can call urban on Europe. So it has attracted a lot of attention in terms of how we understand, how we think about social complexity. What is perhaps a little more difficult to do is actually to look at the formative periods, because the Palace of Knossos was not constructed there, and the archaeology can be difficult to reach underneath what is the later developments. My research actually look at the tombs, because one of the areas in which we have a little bit better evidence of those earlier periods and how things change. And you can see here they can be very different, from jars in which you can put your interment, to caves, to rectangular tombs, to round tombs. But what is very interesting is that through almost 2,000 years of life of these tombs, and independently of how they look, they are all collective tombs. You have hundreds of bodies put in there, many times mingled, disarray with material. So they seem to be emphasizing that community, that communal identity, rather than particular individuals. For example, we will think about the pharaoh. And if you look at the assemblages and you look at things that we know they are precious because they are rare and they are not found on the island, like gold, it has to be imported to the island of Crete. We see that some tombs have more, but most of the communities, it doesn't matter how small they are, they seem to be able to reach those materials. And that's interesting because it shows a much more distributed power than we would normally expect in these early state formation processes. And it's telling us perhaps more about the bottom-up approach in which people came together rather than more hierarchical driven by elites or by the people at the top. This is a research conducted by Professor Torwilo, in which I was part of. This is actually the area of Knossos. The Palace of Knossos is lined there in red, and we investigated the community across the landscape around Knossos. We're trying to work out how big it was, and if we could see changes through times. To do that, we collected material on the surface. We didn't excavate it, we collected material on the surface, and then we date it and we tell where the material was found and which period belonged to. That shows us that in the early Bronze Age we don't have a lot of material, and there seems to be a large community in the region, and they don't seem to be very intensely exploiting that landscape. On the right, you see a major change in 300 or 400 years, which is quite rapid for our standards. And we can see a community that is 10, 20 times larger than it was 300 years, 400 years before. And that as well is a community that is large by any standards of their time. That rapid change demands a different explanation. That, for example, is something that has evolved very, very slowly. And it might be related with Crete actually being more open to connections to the East Mediterranean. They might have changed the society very, very rapidly. Now, we are moving all the way down to West Mediterranean, to Iberia. Well, here is the culture of Legarra around 1800 BC. That is not very different to what we see in terms of Minor Crete, in terms of periods of time. And here as well, we find another complex society. You can see there on the top left large settlements with big walls that indicate that there has been some kind of resources put together to create that wall, and time and effort. We see things like gold in certain tombs. So a lot of people has put forward the idea that we are looking at a very hierarchical society, not very dissimilar to what we see in the palaces of Knossos that I just saw before. My research is trying to look at that similarly to what I've done in Crete, so we can start to compare it. So for that, I'm conducting a project in the area of Legarra. Legarra is what was considered the main site and the capital of the region that you see there marked with a red line. But as any kind of surface collection project, we collect materials from any period, and we have other questions related to not how complexity started, but as well how it moved through time, and for example, how it was affected by the constant arrival of new cultures and new identities. Punic, Roman, Visigoth, Nazarene, Christian. Okay, so those as well, we don't see the process as just one-off, but as a continual dynamic that it would be interesting to look as well through time. What we discovered with our project is the site of Legarra on the right is actually not very dissimilar to many sites in the area. For example, the one on the left in Lugaricos, similar size, similar use. So there is not a hierarchical relationship that will expect, for example, to the much larger Knossos community against much smaller communities on Crete around it. So that tells us that the organization might be complex, but it might be divided in small communities. To make that a little bit clear, you can see here the comparison. And here what is interesting is that we are looking at similar scale in terms of distances. So you can see on the left how big that community on Crete is, as opposed to how small the community is on the right of Legarra. Now, that is interesting for both. This is not just to show Crete, but it shows that it's how Crete was important, but it's how unique it is. To show that in many other places, like Legarra, dynamism and complexity was not unknown, but they don't seem to be able to move beyond a certain scale. But Crete does, and it does it emphasizing the communal identities. So why is that happening on Crete? What is different? Why doesn't seem to find a natural stop those processes as many other places in the Mediterranean do? On the other hand, it's telling us that places like Legarra can be complex without reaching certain scales, and there may be limits to that complexity. Just side project of that project, and it show you a little bit how working in the Mediterranean is so rich in archaeology that you have to think a lot outside the box sometimes. When we collected material from the surface in Legarra, we found plenty of evidence of iron making, iron working. Of course, that has to be historical. They actually excavation in the 1980s that they found an iron making Islamic building in the site. They were not very interested in it. It was not the period, but for us it's actually quite important because, as I said before, power is not something that is negotiated once and then stays hierarchical forever, but it changes the way it is. So the idea that the whole new culture as the Islamic comes into the area and starts to change the way technology works, the way that it's produced, the way it's consumed, is telling us a little bit about how new organization of power appears on the region, and how important is those new cultures and how this new culture mix with the existing culture on the area. So very interesting and something that we at the moment. The other thing about working in the Mediterranean is you cannot work alone, and that's really exciting. That is a rich amount of people that we work together to achieve those projects and to think into these big questions. A lot of local populations, and we really work hard with the local communities, but as well putting information out there, helping them developing the sites. And there is as well a lot of communication with other universities, that other museums, that actually brings new ideas, brings fresh ideas, and it makes studying in the Mediterranean extremely interesting and extremely exciting. So just to finish, just want to make back the point that what we're studying about how power was created and how it compares across the Mediterranean is in many ways about thinking ourselves today and giving us more information about things we are struggling today, about power, who represented, who yielded, who has it, and who has not. Thank you very much. And if you have questions or you would like a little more interest in my research or what the Institute has to offer, please don't hesitate on contacting me at b.legarra@ucl.ac.uk. Thank you very much.